afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the afternoon session of the seminar. And I'm going to introduce to you Cimone Wright Hamor, who's going to take the floor. Cimone, I'll give you a round of applause, everyone.
Alrighty.
Yep.
Thank you. As she said, my name is Cimone Wright Hamor. Today I'm going to be presenting to you about a preventative moving target defense solution for web servers using iptables. For those of you who are unfamiliar, moving target defense is basically an analogy frame based off of the shell game. And the idea here is that we are going to hide some kind of element underneath the cup and ship the cups faster than the human eye can catch, and then ask a user to guess which cup has the element. Now, we can port this same type of analogy over to the digital space in the sense that we have 3 different quote unquote copies of a digital element, and only one of them is live at the moment. And so from an attacker standpoint, the attacker would be the user, and here the idea is to shift them in such a randomized fashion that the attacker is unsure which one is live. Now, the benefits to this are it's a proactive defense mechanism that is ideally in a perfect world withdrawn known and unknown attacks. Therefore, being that it is in the digital space and that humans can't really respond fast enough, they're typically automated and designed to disrupt some form of the kill chain, namely the reconnaissance phase, preventing the attacker from being able to accurately profile the network and the system and determine what is there at any given point in time. So the idea behind this is to decrease the opportunity of attack by changing some part of the system. Now, you probably are aware of this, but ASLR is actually currently being used in most operating systems today. And this is actually a form of moving target defense in the sense that there is some part of the memory that is shifted in a randomized fashion to prevent people from accessing memory that we don't want them to touch. More recently, a OS operating system level of this has been implemented. And the idea behind this is to rotate between random operating systems and decrease the probability of an attack on a particular operating system. So it's not that moving target defense isn't being used today, it's that on a more deeper level, there has been some foundational science that's been kind of skipped, and there's been some assumptions behind this. So in particular, there is a moving target defense solution called DARE, and this particular solution takes iptables to rotate between web servers, and there are some limitations to this, namely that the website being tested was a stateless WordPress website, and part of the reason this is a bit of concern is because WordPress depends on a database, and it's unclear when the attack or the performance is actually related to the database being up, or if it's actually related to the web server being up. So other limitations of the study was that it was manual testing. So instead of writing a script that actually did the testing in a more reliable format, there was refreshing using F12. And then there were some other performance limitations because there were metrics missing. Thus, these types of limitations prevented us from really being able to determine the application and how viable it really was. So although some of the data was very promising, there were some missing things, and that is the gap that this work is seeking to fill. So some of the improvements we did was we improved iptables capability to switch on the same host by really making sure that we're using the most optimal iptable rules and ensuring which decrease the packets by lowering the rotational time. So the previous version was restarting IP tables, and that's not necessarily required. And so every time you restart it, it disrupts communication to the host. Furthermore, automating the testing gave us more reproducible results to give us a more accurate representation of what is the feasibility of using IP tables as an MTD mechanism. And so some of the questions that we looked into were regarding the impact to the user. So it is well known that any security system that has a great disruption to the user is most likely not going to be implemented because it could prevent the user from actually using the system as it is intended. And impacts to the host system. So this type of solution would go on top of the host, and we wanted to ensure that we had minimum overhead. But to capture the difference between that, we had to test the system as a static system, meaning that there would be no rotation. And this type of system is pretty standard. It's normal to see a website that does not rotate the web server that's hosted. And that's what we're considering to be a static system. And then testing it against a rotational system, both a random rotation and then a constant rotation. Furthermore, we also studied impacts to the attacker. So one of the key phases in the kill chain is the reconnaissance phase, AKA the ability to turn around and probe the system to see what is there, as well as the versions. The other thing we did is we tried to exploit the web server using a multi-stage attack. But ultimately, what we're trying to see is if we have a predictable switch order and a random rotation time, does this actually add resiliency, or could we be doing something else to better achieve resiliency? So going into this, the first thing we did was we wrote a script to test the request rate of a static website. And by static website, what we mean is a website that's developed in HTML, meaning that it is displayed as it is stored in the file and is not connected to a database. And this becomes key because depending on the attack you use, if your attack is designed to stress the system and you're using a data or a website that's connected to a database, it's unclear if the stress or the result you get back is either stress from the web server or stress from the database. So when testing the website request here, we did so without attacking, and we just wrote a script that did 150,000 HTTP requests. And what we found is that the standard system pretty much was available all the time. And Dare, on the other hand, which was the original system, had a very high drop rate. So when we were restarting the web server, it takes too long to boot back up. And so during that time, any requests that are supposed to be processed are not queued, they're just completely dropped. Hence is why you see the faster you rotate Dare, the lower the successful request rate is. But DIM, on the other hand, uses IP tables in a slightly different fashion, in the sense that it does live updates of the rules and does not restart IP tables. And so the cool part about this is we're decreasing that drop rate greatly, but also in the event that somebody restarts the host, it's basically giving them back a fresh copy. When they're restarting IP tables, on the other hand, that is not true. So if you BOSH your communications for your host, you're completely going to have to rebuild that. And so the DIM is really acting on temporary rule modification here. We also noted that CPU utilization, when doing DARE, restarting IP tables actually takes a lot of resources. And so you see here that it's almost a little over double what a static environment would be for DARE. But then you'll see that for DIM, there is a very minimal difference. In fact, what we found is that by switching between Apache and Nginx, it actually seemed to have given the CPU a break. And we noticed that by default configurations of Apache, it would consume a lot more CPU if it was just constantly handling all of the requests. So you'll notice up at the top in a static environment, the HTTPD, which is the Apache, consumed on average 19.35%. And so when you go down to the DIM, you'll see that flexing between the 19 and the 15 there. That's why. And then the memory, there wasn't really much change here. And namely because the web servers are not both processing at the same time. And so this was pretty standard. And so it's good to see that there isn't very much impact on the memory here. But it is worth noting that the rotational environments had a higher memory usage, but not too significant here. For our threat model, we assumed a few things about the attacker, namely that they don't have physical access to the resources, and they're focused on gaining root privileges on the web server, namely because the web server is one of those critical components in the infrastructure known for connecting multiple resources together. So once you compromise that, it's pretty easy to kind of pivot and move within the network. From here, we assume they use this CVE from 2019 that would allow them to get root privileges on an Apache HTTPD web server. And this is a multi-staged attack. And so what we have here as a network configuration is that the attacker is remote, and they're really trying to just access this front-facing website to turn around and pivot and move and do other things in the network. So what we noticed is that Nmap's ability to successfully perform reconnaissance on a static system was almost guaranteed because those systems never change. Once they're set up, that's done. Thus, giving the attacker virtually an infinite amount of time to not only probe the system, but turn around, plan, and execute their attack. Versus the rotational environments, what they do is by periodically changing some element of the system, we're forcing the attacker to reset or restart their reconnaissance, thus kind of adding that bit of confusion and disruption in their process, increasing the cost. We'll notice that for DARE, though, it didn't really disrupt it as much. And this is because doing an Nmap scan takes about 6.5 seconds. So when it takes about 6.5 seconds and the rotation time is at minimum 15 seconds, that gives the tool enough time to figure out a little bit of what's going on and return a more accurate result. Versus DIM, on the other hand, greatly decreased the successful reconnaissance, meaning that the results returned are accurate. And it did so because the rotation time is at max 6 seconds. Well, if it's at max 6 seconds and it takes Nmap about 6.5 seconds to do their scan, what would happen here is Nmap would do one of two things. It would either get confused and say, I don't know what it is, or it would return an incorrect result. We also noted that when doing our TAC, it's noted that this attack was specifically for HTTPD. And so we just wanted to verify and ensure that it did not impact Nginx. And this is one of the critical components of moving target defense, is to get a product where their functions are the same, but their implementations are different. This is very, very critical, because the assumption behind that is if a vulnerability for one of the products should not impact the other, namely because they have different implementations. So we just verified that Nginx is not impacted by the attack. And then we also verified that HTTPD is indeed impacted. And so when we started doing the rotational evaluations, we discovered a few things. Although DARE has a lower successful exploit rate, it's not what we think here. The exploit rate is not because DARE is necessarily more resilient. The website was not up as much. So that played into the ability to successfully exploit it if it's not available at all for communication. And DARE, on the other hand, greatly had high availability and low exploit rate, which is what we want. Namely that it was able to throw it off over 60% of the attacks. So this is the type of results we would prefer, but that doesn't mean it's perfect. So the ability to keep a website up for DIM was roughly 98%, but depending on your service level agreement, that might not actually be acceptable. And it had the ability to drastically decrease Nmap's accuracy while having minor impacts on the performance of the host. Additionally, it had the ability to greatly disrupt the attacker's behavior and increase the cost of complexity compared to DARE, where the availability of the website was not in anywhere near an acceptable state. And so when we're looking at these moving target defense solutions, we really have to consider this balance, which may often be ignored. Some of the limitations of modifying IP tables directly is it's too disruptive. If you make a mistake, you actually may hose all communications to that particular system. So any bad rules could result in all communication being lost, not just that particular web server. And furthermore, the web servers are not isolated. So ideally, if one of them is compromised, the whole host is compromised. And DIM does not have the ability to handle dynamic websites. Although HTTP3 is changing a bit of this, so it in the future might not be such a big deal, but right now it still is. And so the idea moving forward here would be to turn around and instead of using IP tables directly, use Firewall D, as it has sectioned things out in zones, such that if you do mess up the rule, it doesn't completely hold all communication to the host. Thus also freeing up and making it possible to do dynamic websites fairly seamlessly. So there is a paper that has already been submitted on this that takes this a step forward to really get down to resolve some of these. But something that should be considered in the future with moving target defense is uncontrolled environments, such as cyber defense competitions. And the reason this is important is moving target defense is really combining the reconfigurability of a network with security. And this is what we're moving into in the space in terms of 5G and connecting HPCs with cloud environments, is the reconfigurability meshed with that security piece. And in order to understand and ensure that we have a minimal level of quality of service, we're going to have to start measuring some of the impacts, not only in latency terms, but to the host and to the user. Additionally, we are going to have to add some reactive capabilities because we can't plan for everything. That is all I have for everybody. I will be taking questions.
Thanks, Cimone.